So I want to just mention that this study was done as part of the Lesbian, Gay, Bisexual, Transgender, and Intersex Global Development Partnership, which has been around since 2012, and has brought together the U.S. Agency for International Development, the Swedish International Development Cooperation Agency, or SIDA, the Arcus Foundation, the Estrella Foundation, National LGBT Chamber of Commerce, the LGBTQ Victory Institute, the Williams Institute, and the Swedish Federation for LGBTQ Rights, or RFSL, and many other partners in the corporate, nonprofit, and NGO world. We have 3 presenters today, eminent presenters from different perspectives. I'll introduce them in the rough order that they'll be presenting. First, we have Jabu Pereira, who is the Executive Director of Veranti in South Africa. Veranti was formed in 2012 to help local and regional sometimes spelling out the acronyms is better, lesbian, transgender, intersex, and gender nonconforming movements in South Africa and across Africa, to use the media as a platform for mobilization and changing the public dialogue. And they've been intimately, Jabu in particular, has been intimately involved in this project. We also have S.N. Nayak, who's a scholar with the Vulnerability and Human Condition Initiative at Emory University, and is also affiliated with Bayreuth University in Germany. And then finally, we'll have Deborah Shepard, who is a lecturer in the Department of Economics at Stellenbosch University in South Africa, and she's also a Stellenbosch Institute of Advanced Study Research Fellow. So here's how we'll do this. We're going to go in that rough order. Folks have some slides to show you, and then we'll have plenty of time for Q&A. So if you have questions, you can hang on to them, or if you want to make sure you don't forget it, if you want to put it into the chat box, that's fine. We won't address it until the end, but at least it will be there in the queue to be addressed by the presenters. So without further ado, let me turn things over to Jabu Pereira. Thank you.
Hi, everybody, and thanks so much for joining us on this call. And also really a huge thank you to the Williams Institute and the team that worked very hard at putting this very important study together, and we are really immensely grateful for the data that has come from the study. We all know how hard it is to find data and to gather data that speaks to marginalized communities such as the LGBTI community, and particularly from this region, it gets particularly harder. So I hope you'll enjoy the conversation with us today. I think what I would like to do just as a start is really kick off around looking at the state of LGBTI rights within South Africa. And I mean, for all of us, we're pretty familiar with South Africa's democracy since 1994. And like most countries in the continent, South Africa too had criminalized homosexuality during apartheid, along with other criminalized laws around race, etc. So we've come a long way, since 1994, and I think that moment of 1994 was very much about putting a legal footprint into the protections that we desire and the hopes that we want for change within our country. Of course, our reality at the time of 1994 was incredibly bleak, but I think the imagined future was very prevalent in the minds of South Africa and what we wanted to see. And I think one of those moments was very much what is emboldened in the South Africa's constitution around looking at the Equality Clause in particular, which is the Section 9 of the Constitution, that really lays the ground for what those rights and protections are. And there's so many grounds that South Africa, I think in a way, when you face so much discrimination like we did during apartheid, which was, racism was very embodied within economic discrimination, and those two things went hand in hand around how the apartheid state operated. And I think this Section 9 clause that is in the Constitution was to say, leave no one behind, and to make sure that everybody is included, even though those rights in that particular time was not realized. So, for example, we still had a penal code that criminalized homosexuality at the time, but the Constitution, stated that sexual orientation would be protected, that gender would be affirmed, sex, and the Constitution is, who would have thought that in 1994 that South Africa would have made a legal protection and distinction between
Okay, then we lost Jabu. Okay. Okay, sorry for the technological glitch, folks.
Would this be a good place for SN to step in?
Yeah, I think we should. Why don't we just move forward with the presentation?
Thank you, everybody. I am equally excited about this report. For those who are familiar with LGBTIQ studies in Africa, they will attest to the fact that this is a report which is the first of its kind. I want to congratulate the Williams Institute and partners and colleagues for working hard on this report and making it available. What I would like to do very quickly is to give the background of stigma and exclusion in South Africa and sort of contextualize it with regard to LGBTI people and draw some conclusion about the importance of this report moving forward. So as Jabu already noted, South Africa, we know, was a colonized territory. And colonization in South Africa really was rooted in two types of ideologies. One was a religious ideology that used the legal instruments of the state to divide, to separate people, to label people, to exploit people. So with regard to the apartheid itself, it was a system in which basically, based on theology, this theology that some people are predestined to be elected by God, and those who are not are there to serve them. And separation then meant, in the context of South Africa, separation by race. As we know, the Dutch settlers, English settlers, and other who followed later were majoritarily white, and the African people were black. So race and racism became a predominant feature of apartheid, and I think we are familiar with that framing of apartheid. What is perhaps less known or talked about is really the ways in which sexuality became weaponized in ways that determine who is seen as a citizen, even among the whites. So this was not just something between blacks and whites. Now, one example of this were the use of law, basically, to exclude people based on this religious ideology. Now, the South African state, being a military state, basically, it relied on conscripts, young, strong white male to maintain the military state. And really, since 1950, 50s onward, there was a coordinated policy to try to make the army the representative, the symbol of what apartheid stands for. And that meant prohibiting, among other things, mixed marriages. That also meant passing laws that prohibited homosexual relationships among the black people, between blacks and whites, and among white people. So one of the really important aspects of sexual repression to note here is that there were camps in South Africa where men were castrated, white young men were castrated, what we would call perhaps today some form of early conversion therapy, trying to make them look fitted for the job of maintaining apartheid ideology. And just like apartheid, political apartheid, so what we see here is that the repression of sexuality itself was damaging young white men, but also sexual expression among the repressed, in this case, the African people. Forced labor, forced sex exchange were part of the military apparatus of the state. Now, I want to quickly also talk about the political liberation as social justice or sexual liberation. So this state of affairs lasted until about the early 1980s, where conversations started about resistance. And again, we are very familiar with resistance as a resistance against racism. But it is important, and this is really the highlight of this report, that as we move forward and start talking about development or African liberation or African rising, that we really go back and retrieve the contribution of LGBT people. And what we see in South Africa is that starting in the 1980s, gay and lesbian people, black gay and lesbian people, were already mobilizing in some sort of intersectional way, not around one issue. They were talking about political liberation as the end of apartheid, the end of segregation. They were talking about access to economic opportunities. They were talking about reconciliation. They were talking about economic opportunities, you name it, bodily integrity. So this is not something that, if we are concerned about it today in South Africa, is something that is an offshoot of, gay liberation elsewhere. It is very much part and parcel of the ways in which African, in this case, South African liberation was conceived and operationalized. So activists mobilized, demanding for integration when it was extremely risky. We know a few of them. Simon Colley was killed. Men and women, Palesa Ditsy, or mostly known as Beverly Ditsy, a key activist, a key figure in talking about political liberation as social justice and as sexual liberation, not around one issue, but around systemic issues that kept everybody subjected to an unfair system. Now, what is also important here is that LGBTI people early on understood the importance of partnership with existing institutions. And the African National Congress, ANC, which, as many people know, has been a force to reckon with in terms of South African politics, LGBTI people managed to get allies and friends that brought on board conversations about equality, conversation about dignity, understanding that political liberation is a good beginning, but it is not an end. So as we move forward, thinking about tomorrow and development and expanding the conversation beyond our traditional voting rights, what this report, as my colleague Deborah will show in a moment, is really digging into the systemic and institutional corners that remain perhaps untouched, unexplored, or not sufficiently explored to make integration and inclusion of LGBTI people whole in South Africa. So I will stop there for now in terms of the background of apartheid and pass it on to my colleague, Deborah. Thank you.
Great. Thank you so much. So we will now turn things over to Deborah Shepard. Deborah?
Hi. Good morning and good afternoon, everybody. I think I'll just begin by reiterating Jabu and Essen's sentiments in congratulating everyone involved in the realization of this report. It was a really, really interesting experience from a data perspective, and hopefully you'll find the results as interesting as I found generating them. So we'll just kick off by saying that there has been little research on LGBTI in the South African context. Mostly the focus has been on LGBT individuals, and very few, if any, studies that have focused on a sort of national perspective as opposed to a case-by-case, particular area, particular sector. So this report adds quite a lot to our existing knowledge. Our two primary data sets that we used, although we did explore others in generating some of the context, were two nationally representative cross-sectional data sets. So the first was the 2015-2016 South African Social Attitude Surveys. So this is a nationally representative cross-sectional survey that is collected every year, and it's been collected since 2003. And in 2015 and 2016, the other foundation, who were the authors of a very wonderful report called the Progressive Prudes Report, they requested that a module be added on sexual orientation and gender identity in the 2015 questionnaire, and the same module was then repeated in 2016. So this gave us quite a large sample size of close to 6,000 adult respondents in South Africa. And unfortunately, transgender respondents were not identified in the data, but using responses to items on specifically sexual orientation and gender identity, we were able to create 4 groups that we then used for analysis purposes. So these were straight or heterosexual gender-conforming individuals. Gender-conforming meaning that it would have been someone who identified as male and self-identified as presenting themselves in public as strongly or mostly masculine. And in the case of someone who self-identified as female, to report presenting in public as mostly or strongly feminine. The second group was then straight or heterosexual gender non-conforming, then LGB gender conforming, and then finally LGB gender non-conforming. So these are the 4 groups that were then used in order to try and unpack the discrimination faced by individuals coming from the LGBTQI community in South Africa in the labor market as well as the health sector. And then the second primary data set used was the 2011 census. And one of the really nice things about the 2011 census was that we were able to match couples together because unique person identifiers were available both for an individual as well as for their spouse or cohabitating partner. So what we were able to then generate were households in which you had a couple who were either a same or different sex partnership or marriage, and this was then used to do analysis on the census data. So based on the SASAS self-identification in terms of sexuality and gender conformity, what we found is that 98% of adult respondents to the SASAS self-identified as heterosexual, and 1.8% self-identified as LGB. And this proportion is within the range identified globally of 1.2 to 6.8%, albeit on the lower end. So we do realize that it probably is an underestimate. And approximately 80% of respondents identified as gender conforming. So in the picture you see in front of you, what you see is that roughly 78% of South African adult respondents self-reported as straight gender conforming individuals, just less than 20% self-identified as straight gender non-conforming, just less than 2% LGB gender conforming, and just under 1% LGB gender non-conforming. And then with regards to the census data, what we found was that 1.1% of couples in the 2011 census identified as being in same-sex marriages or partnerships. And I think at this point, and it is mentioned in the report, we need to remember that this is identifying a particular group of individuals. So these are individuals who report as living together, either as cohabitating partners or as married individuals. And based on the age and marriage or co-residence profile of LGB and GNC persons, we estimate that this 1.1% of couples represents less than 30% of the LGBT adult community. So within the census, it's a very particular group of LGBT individuals who are being identified. And then in terms of the proportions that we found in the SASAS and using the South African adult population, we estimated that at least 634,000 South Africans are LGBTI, and an estimated 7 million people in South Africa are heterosexual and gender non-conforming. So these are estimates that up until this point had not been possible to do. Okay, so if we move on then to the analysis, which then dug into the disparities experienced by these individuals in the South African labor as well as health sectors, and then also in terms of victimization. So the main sort of findings that emerged, particularly in the labor market, was that gender non-conforming LGB individuals were the least likely to be participating in the paid labor force. And this proportion is substantially lower than the other groups. So roughly 60% of GNC LGB persons were not participating in the paid labor force, and this is compared to around a third of individuals in the other groups that we identified. And then gender conforming LGB individuals were the most likely to be unemployed. Given that only 63% of these individuals were identified as unemployed, and we know that a substantial proportion are not participating in the paid labor force, this actually translates to an 83% unemployment rate amongst gender conforming LGB individuals. And then we also found that gender non-conforming heterosexual individuals were less likely to be employed than their gender conforming counterparts. And this difference is roughly 25% less. So it's 12 percentage points lower employment rate than heterosexual gender conforming individuals. And then finally, using regression estimation, what we found is that the monthly earnings of gender non-conforming heterosexuals and gay and bisexual men was on average 30% lower than that of gender conforming heterosexual men. And this was after controlling for socio-demographic and job characteristics. On the victimization and sexual assault front, what we've seen from previous studies is that in the LGBT Wellbeing Study of 2016, their sample, which was collected via social media, they found that at least 10% of the LGBT 16 to 24-year-olds surveyed reported having experienced rape or other sexual abuse at school within the previous 2 years. In a 2013 study of Southern African region, approximately a third of LB women reported lifetime experiences of sexual violence, and this is compared to 4% of all South African adults. So this is in the region of ninefold higher experience of repeated lifetime experiences of sexual violence. And gender nonconforming adults were significantly more likely to feel personally unsafe on most days when compared to gender conforming adults. And this was data that was extracted from the SASAS. And then finally, in terms of the health sector, what we also know from past research is that LGBT people in South Africa experience far higher lifetime suicide rates than the general population, as well as higher rates of HIV seroprevalence. And in the SASAS data, we found that almost half of the health sector workers that participated, and they were identified by the occupation that they provided. We found that at least half, or almost half, of health sector workers that participated indicated that they thought it is disgusting when men dress like women and women dress like men, and that they think gay men and lesbians are disgusting. And this was quite a shocking discovery. And then finally, although dissatisfaction with healthcare in South Africa is generally quite high, at least half of adult respondents in the SASAS did say that they were at a minimum dissatisfied with healthcare provision. The SASAS data did reveal that 70% of gender non-conforming heterosexual individuals and gender non-conforming LGBT adults were dissatisfied or very dissatisfied with their access to healthcare, and this was significantly higher than gender conforming adults. Okay, so that just gives a sort of rough context. The next part of the presentation looks at the costing exercise. So the cost exercise that was applied here followed previous work of Lee Badgett's. And in terms of the labor market impact, here we looked at the loss of earnings as a proxy for lost output in the economy. And in order to do this estimation, there were 4 key parameters that needed to be identified. So the first one was the wage gap, and that was identified as 30%, as mentioned earlier. And then the employment gap, which based on a weighting of LGBT individuals within the labor market was estimated at 7.5 percentage points. And then we needed an estimate of the annual loss in earnings per worker. So based on the labor force survey, the median wage per month for a South African worker, and this is a weighted median, so it's weighted by full, part-time, and casual work, because in the SASAS there was a distinction made between full, part-time, and casual employment. So this was estimated to be 4,900 Rand per month, and if we multiply that by the 30% gap and multiply that by 12 months in the year, we come out at a per annum loss in wages of 17,640 Rand, or roughly $1,300. And in terms of the loss of output for the unemployed, this per annum would be the equivalent of 58,800 Rand, or just under $4,500, which is calculated taking the monthly median income and multiplying it by 12. And then those numbers had to be multiplied by the number of individuals actually being affected within the labor market. So we put the number of stigmatized individuals from an employment perspective at 1.44 million individuals. So roughly this number of LGBT and GNC employed individuals are being affected by labor market discrimination, and 29,000 unemployed LGBT individuals are also being affected by labor market discrimination. So the final cost to the labor market side, which I'll show a little bit later, would then be derived using those annual losses multiplied by those number of individuals. And then on the health side, the measure that was used to cost the health impacts of victimization and discrimination was the disability adjusted life year measure. So the process that was applied here was excess risk to LGBT and GNC individuals was computed as the current daily share, which was calculated as the share of this group within the overall population, multiplied by a risk ratio, so the ratio of the risk to this group as a proportion of the risk to the general population. And you can see those numbers in bold in the table. So for example, when it comes to HIV/AIDS, we estimated that the risk ratio for the LGBT and GNC community compared to the general population was roughly 2. And from this current daily share, you take away the benchmark daily share, and this gives you an excess risk, which is then multiplied by the number of dailies. And then the typical method used within the literature is to take this value and to multiply it by either 1 times the GNI per capita, or as an upper bound, the 3 times GNI per capita. So in the end, because it was identified that it was very difficult to pinpoint the exact proportion of LGBTQI individuals within the South African population, there were 2 lower bound and 2 upper bound measures used in this process. So we took a lower bound of 10% as the population share of this affected group, and an upper bound as 20%. So using those proportions from the pie chart earlier in the presentation. And so you would have a lower bound, which would use the 10% population share, and then the 1 times GNI per capita. And then the upper bound would be the 20% population share and the 3 times GNI per capita. And that's why there's an upper bound estimate as well as a lower bound estimate, giving a potential range of cost. So using these measures, in the end, the cost totals that were arrived at were for the labor market a cost of $317 million due to wage discrimination and underemployment. On the sexual assault measure, we found that the cost experienced there due to victimization experienced by LGBT adults was between $10.5 and $65 million. And then in terms of health disparities disproportionately experienced by LGBT adults, the estimate came to anywhere between $3 and $20 billion. And I think that's where my slides end. So I'll pass it on to Jabu again.
Great. So we think we have Jabu back. Are you still there? Okay. Yeah, they've been experiencing random power outages in South Africa, and I think that's what's gotten in Jabu's way. I don't know, SN or Deborah, would one of you like to take on the recommendation side?
Okay. So as we are sort of putting together early visions of an LGBT state and society that can be inclusive, and reforms of 1990s giving the South African a lovely and very progressive constitution. And as we examine so far what is available in terms of policy and data, we come with recommendations about the ways in which efforts can be undertaken by governments, but also by advocacy groups to bring together a more open space and inclusive space that also empowers LGBTI people economically. So we have made some recommendations to work, for example, with the Commission for Gender Equity of South Africa and other cultural groups and linguistic groups to uphold and expand Chapter 9 of the Constitution. We also think that having national advisory groups is very helpful. What we see and what the data show us is that although the Constitution is an overarching, very progressive legal instrument, there are disparities in terms of implementation. So having a national conversation and not just leaving it to certain agencies depending on, how people feel based on their religious beliefs, it might be important to have national groups that work with LGBTI, transgender, intersex persons and groups on the ground to really help frame the policy and as well as the reform. So it will benefit in order to capture or reduce the loss, the economic loss that has already been highlighted. We would like to see, or we're recommending some sort of synergy between advocacy, providing feedback to government and also policymakers in order to make South Africa economically inclusive.
Great. Thank you. So I know Jabu is trying to get back on. Are you there? Okay. Well, I'll tell you what. We have one more slide if you want to go forward, Winston, and make some suggestions about the private sector and the need for more initiatives related to economic opportunities. But I think maybe we should start the Q&A at this point. Thank you so much, SN, for stepping up in a very spontaneous way. So why don't we take some questions? It's a very there's some parts of this that are quite sort of big picture, and some that are highly detailed, and sometimes it's hard to know exactly where to dig in. But I'm sure some of you do have questions.
Okay. Hi, my name is Nandi from the Plus, the LGBTI Business Network. And I mean, I missed some of, because I had another meeting and I came in late. And no, I just wanted to share just like some of the work that we're doing in terms of really working with LGBTI-owned businesses and with LGBTI entrepreneurs in South Africa, and we're we do partner with QWB and allies. Yeah.
Great, thank you. Did you have a specific question? So you added in a lot of what I think Deborah was going to mention on the slide. Yeah. Thank you. Other folks.
So I see there's a question from Drew Keller regarding the availability of the data. So I can answer that question.
Okay.
So the data used, the census is publicly available through Data First. And so Data First is a open source portal based at UCT. So you're able to request data through there. The SASAS data is not publicly available, but it is possible to approach the HSRC in order to access that data for a particular project.
Great, thank you. Okay, let's see. So Jabu is back, so if you want to ask something of him, you can do that. Okay, so someone has asked, could you please elaborate on the role you see for the private sector? Jabu, do you want to say something about that? Okay, so are you there?
May I?
Jabu? SN, is that you? Okay.
Yes, that was SN.
Okay.
Yeah, I just wanted to. I think it was Nandi. I can't remember the name. Nandi. Yes. Thank you very much, and we want to thank Klaus because during the process of writing this report, we shared some information there. I think what is happening in South Africa is that, people are realizing that the economics is important and that we have to support the entrepreneurs. And I think that the initiative that they've launched there is quite an important one. What we saw, though, in our conversation during this report is the need for more conversation and coordination between activism or activists who have been on the ground and the business community, LGBTIQ community that is emerging, in order to create a synergy between these opportunities. Our sense was that the conversation was not happening yet, or that a lot of people would like to see it happen. So that would be our feedback from the perspective of this report. But also to say that as more business and entrepreneurs come to recognize that identity is important, even in business, it will be interesting to see how we can collaborate together to bring in the tools that might guide that process in the future, so that as we go along, we are collecting the data that is going to be useful, and not wait too long until we move too far ahead. So it will be interesting to see if PLOS and the Business Network can work together with William Institute to bring those possibilities to fruition.
Okay, great, thanks. Someone had a question about whether the presentation will be available, and we're recording it. It will be available online, as is the report. And then we have a question from Isa Bosch. Are there public employment-related programs in place for business founders, or that could be specifically LGBTQI inclusive? So that's a question for anyone who wants to take that on. And I'm going to hand over the facilitation of the rest of the Q&A to Kareth Conran, the research director at Williams. But we have a few more minutes, so please keep sending questions.
Thank you, Lee.
Other questions? Or if someone wants to take on the question about specific programs in place for business founders to add to what we've talked about already.
It looks like one of our participants, Sybil, has offered that the LGBTI Business Network is working with over 30 multinational companies who have affinity groups as one response to that particular question. And Jabu, I'm sorry, we aren't able to hear you. We have a question from Eva. How would you link this report to the SDGs?
I can answer that question. The SDGs, Sustainable Development Goals, as they are known, there are two important goals that are directly linked to this report. First is goal number 5, which is about gender equality, but the other one is goal 17, which is about partnership. And partnership, as understood in the Sustainable Development Goal, means public-private partnerships. And this is where spaces like PLOS, the LGBTI Business Network, comes in to bring the kind of private business aspect to the conversation. And this is where places like, let's say, the Williams Institute, which is a research institution, private in the sense that it is not government, comes together. So what is important actually about the Sustainable Development Goals is that last one, because this is the decade of partnerships. The challenge or the question is, how do we bring LGBT issues as the prime issues that facilitate partnerships? They are the best, in my opinion, because they are multi-layered, they are intersectional, We're not talking about one thing, we're talking about many. And we cannot, as we're talking about law, we're talking about institutions, we're talking about economics, we're talking about human rights, we're talking about people, we're talking about culture, we're talking about history. So what else can bring that sort of partnership and synergy and collaboration, that victimization that is multi-layered and intersectional? So the way of framing this report is to say that it speaks directly to those two, at least. Of course, there are many. We highlight the issue of education. We highlight the issue of health, which are other goals in the Sustainable Development Goal. But those two really always speak to me in terms of talking about LGBT questions as a multi-layered, intersectional, and potentially or issues that facilitate partnership across the board.
Thank you, SN. I appreciate that. We've gotten some questions about where we're going to take this report besides the webinar. We have distributed the report to 91 media outlets in South Africa. We have disseminated it through our networks, including the Global LGBT Development Partnership. We've also posted information about the report to the SOGI Div and other SOGI listservs. If we are hoping to also write up some academic manuscripts just to get, in particular, some of the new quant analyses out into the world to make sure that people know about the South African census and SASAS data sets. Do folks on the call have other suggestions and ideas of places where we should try to distribute findings? Because that would be of great value and assistance to us. Okay. So some folks are having a chat about starting a relationship with the Gauteng Department of Human Settlements to support LGBTI business founders in the supply of construction and the built environment. Other folks are chatting about discussions with the South African Tourism Bureau. So this is wonderful. I'm really excited to see these conversations happening. I hope that folks have ways to connect with one another. I think it's through these dialogues we'll be able to support change in South Africa. And as SN has really highlighted for me throughout this report and process, South Africa stands a terrific opportunity to be a leader for other countries in the region. And so we hope that this work helps motivate and inspire and catalyze efforts beyond the country. I would like to note that the report, which is a 110-page endeavor of love and commitment on behalf of all the people who contributed, includes some other resources that we hope would be useful to others. It includes a review of law and policy related to LGBTQI people in South Africa. It includes an analysis of public opinion. And we also inventoried all governmental strategic plans, noting whether or not they explicitly mention LGBTI populations or not, looked at national health guidance documentation, and also identified South Africa's nationally representative surveys and noted the extent to which they include measures to identify LGBTQI people or not. And so through a set of specific recommendations that go deeper than what we were able to present today, we have tried to highlight specific areas to leverage change and to sort of push the envelope forward in South Africa. And we hope that report will be a resource to you in all of your important work. So I would just like to conclude by thanking the collaborators on this project. Thank you, SN. Thank you, Deborah. Thank you, Jabu. It has been incredible to work with you. Thank you to Lee Badgett, who provided guidance on the economic impact analyses. Thank you to Winston Luher, who's helped set up this webinar, but also did so much labor to help pull materials together for this project. And of course, thank you to our funders. We couldn't do the work that we do without them. Thank you, participants, for getting up early, staying late, spending your lunch on this webinar. And we look forward to finding ways to connect with you in the future. So thank you, and
thank you.
Enjoy the rest of your day.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Okay. Goodbye.
Goodbye.